Hello, my name is Joseph Jeon. I'm the director for the Center of Critical Korean Studies here at UCI, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our event this evening. Before I introduce our speaker, I want to thank Julia Lupton and Illuminations for co-sponsoring this event. We're really grateful for the help and delighted to be working together. I also want to thank Glory Plata, Chang's representative at Penguin Random House, for all the logistical work in setting this up. And finally, our own Juhoon Sin for handling all the details. Speaking of Juhoon, we have acquired a bunch of copies of Chang-rae Lee's new novel, My Year Abroad, which we'll be speaking about today. Chang has been kind enough to sign them for us, and we're just going to give them away. So I don't know if you all can see the chat. But if you can't, it's if you email us at ccks, just the letters ccks@uci.edu, and send us your name, address, and I think we might need a phone number. Then we will be happy to send you a copy until, so it's first come, first serve. We have a limited number of copies, and we're just, we thought, usually in these things you sell them after the event and have this sort of lovely signing, but obviously we can't do that. So we thought we'd sort of, in the spirit of celebration of a great new novel, just do a kind of giveaway. So tonight I have the great honor of hosting Chang-rae Lee. In addition to being a novelist, Chang-rae is professor of creative writing at Stanford University, where he moved to recently after teaching at Princeton for a number of years. He's the author of 6 novels, if I'm counting right: Native Speaker, 94, A Gesture Life, 99, Aloft, 2004, The Surrendered, 2010, On Such a Full Sea, 2014, and his most recent work, My Year Abroad, from this year. And we'll be speaking about this novel today. He also recently co-wrote the screenplay for the film Coming Home Again, which came out in 2019, with the director Wayne Wang, and you should check it out it's on YouTube, I believe. So I first encountered Chang-rae's work in graduate school, namely his first novel, Native Speaker, which has become a kind of standard in the canon of Asian American fiction. It told the story of a gifted, though somewhat aimless narrator, Henry Park, who works as a kind of post-Cold War corporate spy targeting up-and-coming ethnic minorities with political ambitions on behalf of some unseen interests, whose misanthropic intentions Henry has to repress in order to focus on the task at hand. Henry is assigned a charismatic Korean-American politician named John Kwang in the course of his work, but Henry's increasingly compelled by the character of this John Kwang and attracted to his political vision for the poor ethnic communities that populate New York City's borough of Queens, where Henry himself is also from. And so Henry becomes increasingly vexed about his own sub rosa role in hastening what will surely be his target's downfall. I describe his early novel, which perhaps Chang is sick of talking about by now, in some detail because his latest novel, My Year Abroad, returns us to a dynamic between a young man with an uncertain future and an entrepreneurial visionary whose magnitude sweeps up the younger acolyte into a compelling world of possibility. The earlier novel is set in the periphery of the cosmopolitan capital of New York, in the humbler borough of Queens, and similarly, My Year Abroad begins in a New Jersey suburb. But unlike the earlier novel, Lee's latest effort opens onto a thoroughly transnational landscape, moving from the blinkered stateside horizons to Honolulu, Shenzhen, Macau, and back again. Instead of the charismatic model minority, here we have the global citizen who feels at home everywhere despite being constantly in transit. Unless you confuse this with Crazy Rich Asians, the results here are much more vexed and perhaps even a little brutalist. A major through line through much of Chang's work is a deep and abiding interest in extemporized families and the makeshift homes they occupy, even when those makeshift homes are kind of fancy. Whether it's a series of post-apocalyptic / utopian communities in On Such a Full Sea, each stranger than the next, or the weirdly gothic suburbs of Aloft or Gesture Life. My Year Abroad similarly begins in these terms, with Tiller playing house with his older girlfriend Val and her son Victor Jr., as Val and her son hide in a modest house in an unremarkable New Jersey suburb as part of the National Witness Protection Program. But then the novel expands the scale of the inquiry to include capacious transnational circuits that function to disorient characters who seem to both long for and bristle under stability and security. The novel is haunted by a characteristic that we see in much of Lee's work, what is perhaps ultimately an immigrant's sense of perpetual displacement, a paradoxical feeling of not quite belonging even when one feels perfectly at home. Accordingly, throughout all of his work, Chang-rae Lee seems always to manufacture familiarity, if only to pull the rug out from under our feet. These are the geographies not only of native speech, but also of native spaces, in which we find comfort only at our peril. So this is the point of the introduction where I would say, please join me in welcoming Chang-rae Lee, and you'd hear a lovely welcome and applause, but unfortunately I can't provide that for you at this moment. So I'm just going to turn it over to you. I thought you could talk about the novel, maybe read a little bit from it, and then maybe we could have a conversation.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Joe. Great to see you again, if not in person. We will soon, I hope. I'll get down there. And thanks for everyone for tuning in. I thought what I'd do is just read a few pages from sort of the beginning of the book and of my year abroad, and then we could just talk about it, Joe. About well, we don't have to also just talk about this book. We could talk about anything you like. But thanks for that great introduction. Joe mentioned that the narrator of this novel is a young fellow. He's 20 years old, and his name is Tiller. He's 1/8 Asian, and he lives in this place called Dunbar. And this is just a little introduction of that place and how he sees himself. Let's just say up to last year, I pretty much always lived in Dunbar. I was home again for the summer after attending a second year at my small, expensive college, which small, expensive college in particular doesn't matter, and was set up for a semester abroad program in another place that doesn't matter. Except to say that the college and the semester abroad program were one and the same in terms of people and anticipations. Namely, we were generally well off and generally bright and generally interested in the things worth being interested in, like sustainability and creativity and equality and justice, but also generally keen on hooking up and cool beaches and cheap, authentic enough ethnic restaurants, and making connections with people who might offer opportunities for cultural and professional experiences that were life-changing, but hopefully not too much. We would return to the rest of our junior year and bear down and party that much harder in reward, but also for being deeply anxious about the future, a future others before us have definitely ruined, but that we would be responsible for, whether we wanted to be or not. I never wanted to be responsible, even if it meant freedom, even as I grew up with my single parent dad, Clark, who didn't get home until the early evening, stepping into the house from the back door after his walk from Dunbar Station and calling out in his commute-weary croon, "Hey, Till, I'm home," which is when he'd heat us up a quick frozen pasta dinner from a box or take us out for a burger or burrito. We made the rounds around Dunbar like a lot of other lonesome father-child duos. There are plenty of our kind in our divorce-rife town. And when I was younger, I could sometimes score a free soda or side of fries with a glum overbite, the waiter or waitress feeling sorry for me. I never made dinner, nor cleaned the house, just stayed up in my room doing homework or playing games online. A nice lady from Poland came twice a week to vacuum and do laundry, a landscaping crew weekly to cut the lawn, but otherwise I was reposing solo. Clark's one rule was that I never unlocked the front door, that I never opened it unless there was something like a fire or child molester drooling after me, and it was the only way out. None of this makes any sense. You better lock the back door first, if not all of them, but he was fixated. This was obviously more psychological or metaphorical than anything else, which even as a middle schooler, I understood to be important to him. And so this was the prime directive for me, not that I not have friends over or that I stay out of the liquor cabinet or not try to cook anything on the stove. I didn't do any of those things, even though I sometimes wanted to. It's not that I was afraid of something bad happening or my dad finding out. As noted, he wouldn't have freaked out. It was that I had zero interest in being the presiding party, because being the presiding party means you have to retain order and sometimes holler at people and keep an eye out for trouble and be the responsible one, all of which is a total drag. The thing is, I am responsible now, and in a way I never imagined I could be. Not just by taking care of things, not by way of being the type who's steady and maintaining, but by understanding the need to alter the moment, whether directly or indirectly, and then decisively doing so, not worrying about what the future might bring. For example, he's referring here to something that happened in the first chapter. I don't know for sure if it was Todd Brown's SUV that was involved in the crash, and if it was, whether another person associated with him will soon be loitering in the neighborhood again. I don't know what would have been a good, better, or best action for Val. I don't know how any of this will ultimately affect me. All I know is a video of me slicing that tire wall kept popping onto the screen of my mind, and I gave myself over to it like the most enthused bride, a response I can only credit to my time away, which was most definitely abroad, if not so wide. But let me explain. It was midsummer, and I had a few weeks to kill in Dunbar before I was to fly off for my official study abroad program, and as usual, I had to make money to help cover room and board for the year. Clark has been a salaryman for a well-known global financial services firm, and we live in Dunbar Village and not sprawly new Dunbar Crossing just on the other side of Route 111. So people assume we're just as 1%y as most of the other folks around here, but really he's one of the countless mid-level managers in a huge back office facility that's not even in New York City, but in post-industrial New Jersey, though right on the train line, which is why we can live way out here. Clark prefers not to drive. He earns just enough that he pays almost the whole tuition for my definitely not selective enough liberal arts college, but because his sister, my beautiful Aunt Dee Dee, is the way she is, and will reside for the rest of her life in her nearby group home for autistic adults, and has no one else but him to look after her, we have to be careful about our spending. So while my Dunbar friends rode air-conditioned coach buses to sleepaway camps in Maine, and then in later years flew to summer enrichment programs at Oxbridge and Stanford, I've worked every summer mowing neighbors' lawns or walking their dogs, and then, from the time I was old enough, scooping ice cream and bussing tables in a number of the many town eateries. I didn't mind not going away. I would have despised summer school and felt sorry for the zombie instructors burnt out from the regular year, but desperate to make extra bank. I would have enjoyed camp too, for sure, because most kids do, but even a totally gross job like dishwashing can be worthwhile, if not for the usual reasons. Sure, you can't help but develop some grit in the face of being shat upon hour after hour, and come to realize how exploited most people are. But the main thing you learn about yourself and everyone else toiling away is how much of your mental activity and chatter is about dreaming of doing something else, whether noble or debauched or downright silly. Most Dunbarites, adults and kids, are already doing what they imagined, or at least believe they are. Growing up in Dunbar and attending a private college where kids might casually say things like, I feel like treating myself to a snowboarding and spa weekend, and actually mean it, you'd think I'd be inured to this kind of privilege. Truth is, I never much cared about the swank life. It did bug me that I never got off the wait list to be a tag-along for a friend's family trip to Cozumel, or to some dad's corporate box at MetLife Stadium, or some sweet 16 birthday bash at a Michelin-starred sushi place in the city. I heard details so exhaustive of said junkets that I could practically feel the powder spray of the off-piste at Vail, wipe my chin of the buttery Wagyu grease they kept jawing about, but never actually went on anything special unless you count getting invited by Isaiah Pan and his family to Six Flags and getting those skip the line passes, which made the day great. Clark was too old school sensible and frugal and dad clueless to offer any such outings, and it never occurred to me to ask. At the dishwashing job, we worked in threes, and I partnered with different guys depending on the shift, but none of them could stop talking about their imminent trajectories. Take Piquette, an ex-con who for some reason wanted to open up a chain of mani-pedi studios, or Clay Weinberg, a stout, filthy-mouthed teen who wanted to write and direct sci-fi pornos, or the gray-haired former acid freak whose real name we didn't know, so we just called him Jerry, after Garcia, who was studying tax accountancy at the community college so he could do people's returns. "Hey, Jerry, you could do my dad's taxes next year," I shouted to him after he told me his final term was almost done. This through the din and fetid searing steam of the washers. I was in the clean out position, clearing the leftover food off plates and emptying glasses and letting the conveyor take them to Jerry, who'd slot them as fast as he could into a tray and then push it through to the double-doored washer, which after 30 seconds was clawed out on the other end by a guy wielding a hook. "Does he have self-employed income or foreign investments and limited partnerships?" Jerry yelled back, though he actually never yelled, just sort of intensely whispered. "I don't think so," I said. "He just works for a company. I think he has a 401k. With great prudence, Jerry shook his big nose at me. Then he should just get one of the popular computer tax programs. They're really very thorough and so easy to use. "Jerry, okay, hey, check out these scallops." Jerry never wanted any of the leftovers like Piquette or Weinberg would, and I plucked them off with tongs and set them aside on a big platter just for edibles, which we called the toilet. This was the most important part of the job when you worked clean out, to make selections for the toilet. I was more discerning than others, but the one basic rule was that the food item could have no bites taken out of it. So whole raviolis were always toilet ready, but not linguine, which could have dangled from a diner's lips. Never mixed salad, but definitely a clean spear of pickle. Fries were always fine, except if they were smudged with ketchup or cheese sauce. The exceptions were any remainders of cocktails or wine, which were immediately gulped down. We picked at the toilet all night like it was green room catering. You'd be amazed what Dunbar diners left on their plates, especially the older ones and the 2 iron-thin ladies, who might eat just 2 jumbo shrimp out of 5, or take 1 cut out of a perfectly good strip steak that was slightly too rare for their taste. I'd eat off a plate if I was super famished, often after a couple tokes out back with Jerry or one of the bussers, and then only if it was something the diner couldn't possibly have spit out. I'll just stop there. And he meets, after that scene, he meets for the first time his counterpart in the story, a guy named Pang Lu, the Chinese businessman, with whom he ends up, doing all these crazy adventures, and which he recounts in later time while he's living with Val and her son Victor Jr. So.
Thank you so much for that. That was wonderful. I guess let me just start you out with some kind of basic questions, just to sort of inform the audience. Can you just tell us just how you started the book, how you got the idea for it, and how it developed?
Yeah, well, I first came up with the character of Pang Lu, the Chinese businessman who lives in this town and who we'll meet in the next scene. And he was inspired by a friend of mine. I was living in Princeton. As you mentioned, I taught at Princeton for many years, and for people who don't know Princeton, it's one of those classic American towns, of the old school variety, the train station and lots of quaint shops and quite tony and prosperous. And I'd lived there, just near campus, and met a fellow, a Chinese guy. I don't know that he'd call himself American, even though he's an immigrant. And I was just really taken with this fellow. He was a little younger than I was, or I am, and I was just amazed by all the enterprises that he had going. He was not a super rich guy, but someone who had some money, but was a kind of wild investor. He would just invest in all these different things, and some of the things I use in the book, like a tofu place, a tofu production facility in Amish country in Pennsylvania, and a Indian themed wedding hall, and a little shop in town. He also had rentals. So I just loved getting together with him. Our daughters were friends, and just talking about all the things that he was into. And I didn't really have any aim to write about him. I just I just loved hearing about, his curiosity, his exuberance for the chase, and people would say, "Oh yeah, Pong, he knows everything." I'm calling him Pong. I won't use his real name. And ended up, people thought of him, actually the people who knew him in town, to be kind of, the guy you went to for any kind of advice about anything. He just knew everything. And I just love the idea that he was this, immigrant, but so different than the immigrants I grew up with, in my generation, who, pretty much went under the radar, weren't comfortable in the culture. They didn't have a lot of means, or not that they didn't have a lot of ambition, they did, but they didn't, I don't think, felt as if they were in any way in command, right? They're in command of their own little world, their own private little enterprises, whatever that might be. But this fellow, he just impressed me and inspired me, and so I thought, damn it, I'm gonna write a book about him, new kind of immigrant novel, new kind of immigrant figure. But the more I started writing his story, and I really was getting into his background and all the things that he was doing here. Um, the more I realized that it was also important in the story, at least for my take on it, for someone to be in the place I was, someone who needed inspiration, who was looking for a different kind of energy, who was, um, you know, musing about a different scale and shape to the world for a guy like him. And and so that's where I came up with this younger fellow who lives in the town, who's, considers himself pretty unexceptional, not very ambitious, but who it gets taken up by Pong and becomes his protege, and assistant, and in some ways partner, in a partner in crime. So that's pretty much how the book came about. And I would say that's fairly typical for me. I start on one thing, and then the more I think about it, especially once I start writing it, other kind of urgencies present themselves, where
Yeah.
I find myself actually more curious about a particular aspect of the story and not just the big story. And maybe that's also a way, just a strategy of or a tactic of just being able to do it, like just, kind of honing the story and making it a little bit more narrow, at least on entrance, um, so that I could actually, go about doing it.
So that's really interesting that like decided that this book was about this your friend, and then tried sort of in a secondarily figure out uh, the narrator, who's obviously also an important character in the novel. And I guess this just made me think about your narrators in general. Like, and I guess I was just curious about how you think about them. Um, I mean, I think you mentioned at some point in your description, it's like, I think you said the phrase something like a way to get at or something like that. Like, I guess I'm curious how I mean, you have some very distinct narrators of various different ethnicities, various different ages, different, socioeconomic backgrounds. So there's not really like, it doesn't feel like a version or a stand-in of you at each point, sort of looking at the world, right? And so it seems to be very kind of strategically chosen in a lot of ways. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit more generally throughout your fiction about how you think about, the narrator, both as a character, but also as a kind of, a lens or a perspectival point to sort of investigate or think about the larger topics and issues you want to talk about.
Yeah, I think that's a really great question, because people assume that you come up with this character, and with he or she has a history and a set of concerns, and a certain kind of a sighting in a place, but and then you end up finding a story for them. But I think in the end what happens is that you start out with that figure. I mean, of course, you need to have a certain kind of foundation, but then a certain kind of mutation happens depending on that perspectival interest. That point of discovery and curiosity that the character will have. which I think comes just sometimes by accident, sometimes it's something that's been hidden. Um, again, as for example, what I was talking about I guess my feeling just as a person that of and questioning, why am I so interested in this guy at this point in my life? What about the world, my place in it? So that's an example of that particular perspective and that particular, you know, I guess grounding of that lens, or fixing of that lens, then in turn starts to determine what that world will be, and how this person is going to, um, illustrate it for us, with in language, in emotion, and sensibility. Uh, so it's a kind of dialogue that happens, once that character goes, once I actually situate that character, depending on what he or she will then encounter. Um, so it's this feedback loop that is, I hope, dynamic, and that I hope continues to to mutate that character in interesting ways. So I think in all my books too, particularly, I mean, I can talk about any of them, but say my second novel, A Gesture Life, um, that novel too was originally supposed to be a novel, in my thinking, a story directly about, the so-called comfort women, or those women who were, enslaved by the Japanese military, to be sexual servants to their soldiers. And of course, I was thinking about that time, and um, that awful point of history. I wanted to just tell their stories, but the more I got into their stories, I realized, well, of course I want to tell their stories, but in some ways, the story of someone who I hadn't heard from, say a perpetrator, someone who was complicit, someone who had contributed to that tragedy, um, uh, from a position of power or dominion, was actually the story that I hadn't heard and that I was even more curious about. Um, and I felt that I could give, a certain kind of perspective um, that might, expose something about, some other issues. And those issues happen to be a sense, of assimilation, a kind of monstrous assimilation, uh, to be with the side of the powerful. Um, and also lots of, reckonings about one's own guilt and complicity. So that's, again, that was a situation where, I needed to wade in pretty deeply before, I could really figure out, what the really pressing urgency of my interest in this story is, because I don't think it's ever what I think what I first thought it was,
Hmm.
in conception. It's never even come close. Um, and if anything, if I learned anything as a writer over the years, is to not be so, enamored and wedded to that initial inspiration.
Interesting.
To embrace it, celebrate it, but be ready to revise, um, and to reseed.
I should take this opportunity. My colleague Chung-Woo Choi is asking a question about geography and spatial settings. So speaking of A Gesture Life, she asked, how do you choose geographical or spatial settings when you first start and plan a novel? And I guess that is a similar question about the place. I mean, the settings and places in this novel. I mean, I've made a little bit of a joke about Crazy Rich Asians, but there's a aspect of this novel that's very cinematic, right? You feel like you're going all over the world, and you have the establishing shots of the waves breaking over, in Hawaii, and then the scene in the casinos in Macau. So I guess like just I guess to combine those two questions, just how you think about setting and how you arrived at these settings and why they were important for this particular story.
Well, for my year abroad, I knew that this would be an Asian novel in terms of setting, in terms of you know, in terms of what this adventure would breach. Um, uh, because and this is of course from the point of view of young Tiller, who hasn't really gone anywhere, who didn't know he wanted to go anywhere, who didn't even know what he was going to see. Um, but of course, so I knew that his travels in this particular novel would have to go all around certain, obviously, in the context of their work, which is commerce. So these are quote unquote business adventures, and so businessmen will do certain things that, say, academics won't do in terms of their travels. Academics, we go to these nice little conferences here and there and meet other academics. But so yeah, there's that kind of madcap antic energy that I wanted to put on because of who these folks are. So perhaps that's an answer to a part answer to the question, which is it depends on who these folks are and what kinds of things not only would they naturally see, but also what kinds of things, most importantly, can I create or set up so that it can challenge their assumptions, it can challenge who they are, it can break them down in some ways.
Mm.
I mean, I think not the business of novel writing is always to put your people in situations where they don't have control. And so the most boring novel, of course, is just people winning all the time, right? Because they know what they're doing and they're confident and they're gifted. We dream about that, but in fact, that's not what stories are about. Stories are about people who maybe believe they're in control or hope they are, but absolutely aren't. So I mean, I don't know if that answers the geography question, but I do definitely think about geography and settings and particular situations as points of challenge, as points of friction, and possible again sort of psychic revision. That they're going to be confronted with, in some ways, a mirror of themselves, but a mirror that they didn't quite know that they were going to see.
Mm. I wonder if we could think about geography, but less in terms of literal place, but maybe in terms of power or cultural change. And this is your second novel in a row now that has been interested in I'll just say China. It's like a large category, but
Yes.
Obviously very specific things. I just wonder if you can talk about that. Why you're interested in China, the history, or I mean, like obviously very different approaches. One is a kind of contemporary, kind of as you say, business oriented, but maybe about the transnational circuits of capital, to use the academic phrase, or on the other hand, like this kind of a post-apocalyptic, it's deeply about like historical transition or something along those lines.
Yeah. Well, I've been interested in China for a while now, and this is in some ways my second China novel, one could say. The first one is my last one, On Such a Full Sea, as looks at China, I suppose, in a slightly different way than what would be housed in a normal contemporary story, which is why I ended up making a speculative novel and setting it in a different time and slightly different place. But I've just been impressed and startled, just horrified, everything that's going on in China. I'd always thought that in writing my last book, I always thought that I think we need, as global citizens, particularly as Americans too, we should be students of China. We should just be watching everything that they're doing. They're a huge juggernaut in world economic and cultural history and political history now. And to ignore that, it seems, is insanity. And not just for political survival, just for interest, interest of political, cultural, social, developments in our world. And, from the amazing, industrial capacities that they have, to the increasing, just political power that they have because of that, and also their other kinds of moves, both positive and very negative. No one, we don't talk enough, I think, at least at this time, about all the human rights abuses that China is committing against its people, and like, say, for example, the people of Hong Kong. So it's a country that, in my view, is going to be the lead country of the 21st, 22nd century. And so that was so these novels are in a way of my just working out my curiosity, interest, all those things about it. And just, I guess, recognizing, my own, in some ways, anxiety. But the anxiety is not necessarily a negative word. Just the kind of, that we rub up against China all the time now, in everything, from what we wear to eat, maybe more culturally now as we move forward. So I think it's just a fascinating time to be alive.
Let me turn to, actually, let me take this opportunity to invite questions from the audience. We have a couple here. This is from my colleague in the English department, Jane Lewis. I'll just read what she wrote. She wrote, I have always loved all of your work and continue to, exclamation point. I also did my time at Princeton. Speaking of elite academic institutions, I'm struck by how much being at an insufficiently selective liberal arts college dominates the narrator's mind from the start. I see that near obsession as connected to the food, quote, selections for the toilet, two kinds of objection, even of shame, albeit mixed with defiance. I'm wondering how much teaching at a highly selective institution, and maybe this idea of selection more broadly, highly politicized right now, shaped your conception of this protagonist and his voice. Thank you for your wonderful reading and unforgettable art.
Yeah, I thank you for that question. I absolutely thought about this protagonist and this narrator's unexceptionalism in a way that is inherent to him, at least in his self-view, but also to think, I think, about American unexceptionalism, because we hear so much about American exceptionalism otherwise, right? And in a way, I wanted to set off, aside from the question of just elite institutions, and I have other thoughts about that, but one of the things that one of the notations I wanted to make in this novel was about America's place in the world. This is in the context of what I was just talking about with China, and our, the increase, the truth of our, of a certain kind of a trend of diminishment, of being less and less relevant, being less and less at the center of the story. That in an increasingly globalized space, that our sense of ourselves, our sense of our power, will be continually put more towards the margins, as just as an important player, but not the major player. And I think that's partly what Tiller, as a narrator and as a being, just has ingrained in him. Somehow he's a little bit ahead of the curve, maybe. Mm-hmm. He feels that his time has passed, even though he's only 20 years old. He sees all these other exceptional kids go to the elite college in his town. And yeah, he's defiant, but I think he's also realistic. In turn, of course, he's looking for some other kind of excitement, some other kind of juice, that doesn't have to do with elitism, or he's looking for something maybe more basic, some visceral energy, some savor of the world that he just hasn't gotten yet. And so that's I think where, he fits in terms of this idea of being special, of being selected, versus um, going out and looking for something special or not, maybe outrageous, but just in that I guess that motile um, kind of space where you're just trying to go, and and not being so, I guess, encumbered by the baggage of credentials or excellence or all these kinds of things, which, I love my students, but sometimes I feel like, yeah, yeah, they do feel encumbered by all the things that they put on themselves, and others, mostly others, have put on them too.
Mm. Speaking of savor of the world, this is a novel that's preoccupied with food, and I think Jane mentions this as well. But the most surprising part of the novel, I have to say, was the whole pop-up restaurant inside the house thing. Like I kind of didn't know where it came from, and so I guess I was just curious if you could just talk about that. And it's not just the plot element, but also like the way Tiller is like really, I mean, he's got, really fine taste buds. And in addition, he's really good at describing tastes as well. Like it's sort of a linguistic thing as well. So just could if you just talk about that part of the novel. I'm just
Yeah,
very
yeah.
curious
Well,
about it.
obviously, it's focused on the food that the son of his girlfriend ends up being. He ends up being this child prodigy chef, and so they create this outlet for him, which is, supposedly in witness protection, which is probably the worst thing that they can do, is to open a pop-up restaurant out of their witness protection house, which is part of the point, I suppose. It's a way of them getting out into the world themselves, and also I think for Tiller, a way to connect with this young boy, who at the start of the book is something of a horror to him, petulant, spoiled, unruly. But I think it's a way for them to, and maybe this is how food works for me, but and for a lot of people, especially I think us Asians, is just a way to connect and a way to bond, a way to enact responsibility, enact a certain kind of devotion, and love. So I think it's about, for me, that whole storyline is, it gave me a way to embody both the anxiety of their and fraught nature of their hiding. Of course, there's something else going on, but also to give them something through which they could enact, their feelings for one another, to work through the kinds of things that Tiller needed to work through, which is, taking on responsibility, being there for someone else, growing up, basically. He's I in some ways I needed to put Tiller in the role of not just of a lover and partner, but of a father too. Um, Someone who could help mold somebody else, and I thought that was important in the book, emotionally.
With Tiller, I mean, maybe this is sort of circling back at a couple of things you've already talked about from a slightly different angle. When you mentioned that he's 1/8 Asian, why? Like, why did you do? Like, why did you make that choice about him? Why is that an important characteristic about him? I mean, there's some plot elements, connection. There's some plot things connected to that. He knows a little Mandarin, things like that. But I'm just kind of curious why you made that choice about him.
Yeah, it was purposeful and intentional. Because when you think about a character, you wonder, well, who is this person? What exactly does he, where did he come from? What's his legacy, ethnic and otherwise? And I knew that he had an interest in Asia and a connection to Asia. I didn't know what that connection was, but when I first thought about him, but at the same time, I didn't want him. I wanted him to be kind of set aside, or at least self-set aside. I didn't want him to be fully Asian, so that his interest in Pong and going to Asia. I didn't want it to be like the center of the story, right? A story of discovering or exploring identity. He doesn't really do that, at least in what he talks about or in his internal narration either. But I wanted it to be there as a kind of beacon, maybe fogged over, that he was just kind of curious about, there's kind of scratching at him all the time. Especially there's a little section in early on in the book, he talks about his Asian friend, fully Asian friend, Wendell Chung, who goes skiing, and Wendell talks about how he can hide. He's not seen as Asian because he's in this white place, literally a white place, fancy ski place, with goggles and a ski mask and everything like that, and he's treated as one of them. And I wanted Tiller to be, in addition to not being exceptional and not being selected, but also someone who was ethnically and racially kind of under the radar, mostly passing, mostly not trying to think about it, mostly not wanting to think about it, but that he's just emerging now into a certain kind of tropism towards Asia, and towards a fellow like Pong. It's no accident that this Chinese guy captures his fancy and inspires him, and not somebody else. And so it's a different, I suppose, kind of identity novel that way. Where maybe we're just at the beginning of Tiller's inquiries.
I don't know if it's related to that or not, whether it's a way of saying it, but the one vivid description of Tiller that sticks out in my mind is, I think you called him, I forgot which chapter this is in, but you called him like a compulsive joiner.
Yeah.
And his compulsions are really interesting as well, and they often lead him down into difficult situations. And I don't know if that maps onto the 1/8 Asian part or not. But, yeah.
Well, he is a joiner. He's a latcher-on too, right? He feels almost like an orphan, even though technically he's not. And I think that's part of how I felt, and I think a lot of us feel, immigrant peoples and minority people. We're kind of orphaned from the culture that, as you say, we mostly feel that we should and do belong to at certain moments, right? We can walk around and feel as if I'm absolutely locked in here. My boots fit in these skis, but sometimes something will happen. Someone will say something. There'll be a situation where you realize that bond is very tenuous. It's very fragile, and you can pop out at any time, and then where are you, right? And I think Tiller's someone who's looking for ways to latch on, ways to join, and he likes this group of businessmen, most of whom, except for one, are South Asian, Pacific Asian. There's something about them that feels right to him, and he doesn't really talk about it that much. There is a little scene where he talks about Pong and this other guy, Korean guy, how they squat in the shower, in the Korean style shower, and he wonders about their posture, and should he do that? And so there's some modeling going on here, some notations to self about how should I be, and I think that was just, to me, just his natural both curiosity and maybe some yearning.
Here's another question from the audience. this is also about a gesture life. Your gesture life and Bernard Schlink's The Reader came out about the same time, and the two novels deal with the banality of evil in the sense of Hannah Arendt in a way. I'm sure it was coincidental, but was there a specific reason for writing the novel at the time, grappling with such an issue? And I guess I'll just take the opportunity maybe to generalize that question a little bit and think about, I mean, there is definitely, cruelty in this novel. And, it may be in a slightly, like a banality of cruelty. I'm not sure if that's a phrase, but banality of cruelty. But I wonder if you could talk, do you see any handles there to talk about both this novel, but also maybe to your earlier work?
Yeah, well, that work back in, it was just, I don't know about the timing of it. It was just the time that that I came upon the story, and there was a lot of talk, the whole history of that, of the comfort women just kind of blew up in the mid 90s, mid to late 90s. And so it was just getting a lot of attention. And of course, as a Korean American, a Korean person, I was, interested in it. And again, that idea of the, what you say, banality of cruelty. I was maybe not banality so much, but for me, it was just the, how it can hide so well in someone who's otherwise, doing everything he can to be good, to do the right thing. And so I was interested, I think, in how cruelty resides in all of us, and how it can be shocking and horrifying. For me, a gesture life is a kind of a monster tale. A tale of someone who that you gradually realize is horrific, even though you don't even want to you don't want to feel that he's that way, and he's kind of trapped you and convinced you that you shouldn't feel that way, but in the end you absolutely should. And so it's more about the horror for me of personality, the potentials of personality, that and action, um, um, that I was interested in, and in my other characters too. I think unlike, well, in this novel, not much is hidden. In this novel, everything's kind of blown up and exploded outwards. But in my other novels, I think a lot of the characters are, they're kind of self-cloistered and looking for ways, consciously and not, to release, to open little doors onto themselves, just because that's the only way that they can survive psychically. Let in a little truth and light, and let others see that.
So we're running toward the end of the hour, and I would love to just talk to you forever about this stuff, but I do realize we're running out of time. I'm going to ask you sort of a general question about just the kind of a lot of writers are uncomfortable with these kinds of questions. I wonder. I apologize in advance if you are, but just thinking about the shape of your career so far. This is now your, I think I said your sixth novel. You've been doing this for quite a long time. To quote that other great New Jersey writer, you were recently, John Bon Jovi. He once said, like, you have you have your whole life to write your first album, and like 18 months to write your second one. And it was about being like the compression of time and the difficulty of that, but it was also sort of about like moving away from the things you were interested earlier on, and then moving in other directions and moving outwards, and the challenges, difficulties, pleasures of that kind of change. And just to kind of think in very macro terms about your career, you have these kind of early novels well, the first novel about, a Korean American character, and then a series of novels that, engage Korea in certain kinds of ways, and then a distinct pivot. A lot of people, I think, regarded On Such a Full Sea as pivoting, like not just in terms of a different subject matter, but also genre, right? I wonder if you could, do you have any thoughts or reflections about like the shape of your career so far, and or if those kind of questions are like are precisely the kinds you have to kind of push away in order just to kind of focus on the work or whatever.
I think it's healthier to push those away. Because in the end, we're all, regardless of what you do, but particularly people who produce things, create things, everything is, we all do things so consciously, right? I mean, we're so conscious about this project, and it'd be dishonest to say, well, this is why I'm interested in it, and this, but in the end also, so given all that intentionality and consciousness and self-consciousness, um I think it just, as I mentioned before, there's so much just about accident and improvisation and circumstance that in the end, um, is sort of befuddling. You just don't have an idea of why you ended up writing that book. And why the modalities you chose are the ones you ended up with. It just kind of, in the end, it becomes the legacy, even though there was no, if there was a plan, the plan was abandoned, waylaid, misexecuted.
Mhm.
And so I don't know, I mean, it's, I'm working on a new book now, and I'm just, again, I'm just focused on it and why I'm interested in it, and it's a very different book, um, I hope, and maybe that's the only thing I'll say about it that I can maybe be confident of, which is that I never want to write the same book twice. It's just so boring to do so. I never want. People have asked me about writing sequels to Native Speaker, and bringing Henry Park back, and I it's just that to do something like that and to have a recurring character, a recurring kind of place. Now, I'm not saying that other writers haven't done that beautifully, but and that I've admired as a reader. It's just, for me, I would already feel dead at the beginning.
Mm.
I would already feel, sort of like an undertaker. And maybe that would be the most interesting thing to do for me, which is to take a character and completely deconstruct
Mm.
it. Him, her, the whole project and the whole proposal. Um, but maybe that's what I'm doing in every book. Who knows?
I love the idea of misexecuted plans as like the method, the writerly method, and you've certainly been successfully mix executing plans for a very long time. So, um, oh no, are you frozen? Uh, is it me that's frozen, or is it you?
I think Chang-rae
Is
was.
Chang's frozen? Uh, well, um, let me address the audience. We're at the end of, unfortunately, we're at the end of our time. At the very beginning, I did announce a giveaway for a signed copy of this Chang-rae Lee's new novel. If you email your name and address and your phone number, it's a first come, first served. There's a limited number to ccks@uci.edu. We're happy to send you a copy of the novel. And thank you so much for coming. And we'll see you all next time.